Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. The Wendigo loves you. People always talk about how the Wendigo is so evil, which sounds like a funny thing to say. People always talk about it. But what I mean is, when the Wendigo is being talked about, he's portrayed as a malevolent being who couldn't care less about the lives of human beings. The implication is that the Wendigo doesn't like to socialize. You couldn't be more wrong. The Wendigo is utterly fascinated by other people, their thoughts, their feelings, what makes them tick. He'll ask questions other people won't think to ask, and he'll inhabit bodies others have tossed aside. I met a woman earlier today, an ordinary day until she knocked on my door. She was an older woman, over 60, with messy gray hair and a smile that suggested a much younger age. She said her name was Doris as she grabbed my hands, looking at me with pleading eyes. I asked her what was the matter. Doris claimed it was vital she speak with me. She said she believed she had been sent here by a higher power. As I stood blocking the door, I asked Doris what her religion was. Not a mainstream one, she said. I won't preach to you about the afterlife or what it means to be a good person. We both laughed at the same time, the same old lady cackle. A harbinger of things to come, I guess. I invited Doris in, instantly liking the woman. She sat at the kitchen table while I put on hot water on the stove for tea. All I had was Earl Grey, from when my girlfriend comes over. I reached into the shelf where we stored our tea and took out 2 bags of Earl Grey. Milano cookies too. Doris asked if I had a philosophy for my life, and I hesitated, clandestinely wiping some stray crumbs off the counter. I couldn't understand why, but I really cared what this woman thought of me. I don't know, I said. Live and let live, I guess. As long as no one is hurting me or my family. Doris nodded, an odd smile on her face. Her face seemed like it started to melt then, skin dripping like candle wax. Are you okay? I could hear the sound of my own voice, but it sounded far away as the question escaped my lips. Doris acted like she didn't even hear me, and she began talking about an alternative religion that would let me carve out my own path. And even if I walked my own path, I didn't have to do so alone. She wondered if I knew about the grace of the Wendigo, a great power that seeds in all of us. Doris grew antlers and eyes as red as a blood moon. I saw that playful smile on her face, suggesting hundreds of years of wisdom. I could tell by the grin that she, the Wendigo, liked tricking people. It was a gentle kind of deception, the kind that made you feel good. You laughed afterward when the joke finally clicked. I looked at her face. More melted skin fell from it and landed bubbling on the wooden table. I felt a little dizzy, but pleasantly so. We talked some more about philosophy, life, and religion. I realized then that there was no difference between these concepts. One lived as one believed. I believed that the Wendigo had my best interests at heart. Its trickery amounted to harmless play, and if you think about it, that's how friendships are forged, through fire and the twisting of flesh for some conscious purpose. I felt such a deep connection as I stabbed her neck. I cried. I thought about how she had changed my life, opened up my mind to new possibilities. I enjoyed our conversations, which branched out into many, infinite conversations. It was though I had known Doris for years, a mentor that had faded away because of my omnipotent hand. The old woman became a husk, a skinless lump in the middle of the floor. Lit candles encircle her corpse, and I'm sipping Earl Grey tea in her honor. I'm sitting here, wearing the skin of Doris, my friend. Such a surreal feeling. If you don't believe me, try it out for yourself. But be warned, you'll never experience anything like it again. The immense spiritual pleasure dissipates eventually, but the lifeless wrapping remains. I never had a true friend until I met Doris. Now I'm watching the Wendigo devour her like a rabid dog. With each finger consumed, I'm losing my connection to her. All the neat things we talked about, gone like the wind. I'm hearing whispers, faint echoes that prove to me our conversations actually happened. The Wendigo is my friend now, even if it's from a distance. He can be your friend too. He loves you. Second story. What lurks beneath the surface of Saskatchewan? Ever wonder what is in the earth? Most would think of the worms and bugs that crawl around in the soil. Others would think of the many dead, man or not, that took their last breath before becoming part of the earth again. Some would imagine the burrows made by animals like rabbits or badgers to provide shelter. A few would think of the hot rock deep below, ever so churning. For me, the earth below us is a place for something else entirely. I shudder to remember all of my experience, but I had to so that it is out there, as a warning to others if they were to experience a similar situation. For most of my life, I have lived in a hamlet in Saskatchewan. I will not tell its name as I do not want anyone to experience what I had experienced, but I will try to put context so that it makes sense to anyone who would be in a similar situation to mine. The hamlet was at one time a town, relying on the railway to provide for its residents and businesses. It was that way until a fire in the early 1920s that destroyed half the town. I do not know how many people died in the fire, however. What is known is that the hamlet never got to its former glory. The only people who lived there were either the religious Mennonites or people who wanted a simpler life. I was part of those who wanted a simpler life, of which I grew up here since I was still an infant since my parents moved from the city of Saskatoon. While I do have a few fond memories, all that I did is do chores and watch TV, while also going to school in another town a few miles from here. We don't farm. Unlike those outside of the hamlet, we are more like one of those people whose parents had worked somewhere else. Overall, in this hamlet, almost everyone knew who everybody was, except for me. During my free time, I would read a few nonfiction books and draw maps that would pop out in my antisocial teenage head. In summer, I would go outside and explore the natural world and the hamlet itself. The weird thing I should mention is that our house is the only one of two surviving structures that survived the fire, which is an achievement in itself. The other is an abandoned brick 3-story schoolhouse a block away to the south. It is built in the mid-1910s and abandoned sometime in the 70s, maybe because of a lack of funding to keep operations going. It was bought out by many owners, people like us, but wanted their life to be a little more grandiose. But every time, they would either move out or disappear without a trace. We always assumed the ones gone likely moved out without any of us knowing. I was no different. I used to think that the reason they moved out is because it is difficult to maintain, at least cost-wise. I have heard that water, heating, and plumbing are the main problems, at least what I thought. I would occasionally hear, at least, the bells going off from the schoolhouse, most times when it was supposedly unoccupied. I thought it was the Mennonite kids sneaking into the building to cause a bit of grief upon the town. How wrong I was. It all began during a snowstorm, of which I was sleeping in my bedroom. It was very cold, as we had been struggling with water heating at the time, so I tried to stay warm using hand warmers, which I am not supposed to use under this circumstance, but there is really no other way. I was in a shallow sleep until I heard something amongst the howls of the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind until I strained my ears to listen closer. I could recognize a scream, not the one you would find in horror movies when someone is being killed, but rather an animal in agony, like a cow or something. Usually, if this was the case, coyotes would be yapping around, attacking the animal and sound off their victory cries. Instead, there was nothing else other than those sounds and the near-deafening wind. I think it lasted for a few minutes before it stopped. The next morning, there was no school, but that was the least of my concerns. One of our farmer friends, Bob, called my mother to say he was missing a few cattle from his pasture, which is on the other side of my house, across the gravel road. He did come over and asked us, along with our buddies, to try and look for the cattle, dead or not. The fresh snow, however, would make this task difficult as the remains of the cattle would be buried in the big snow drifts formed from last night. Eventually, we did find one of the cattle. The dead cow itself was found in one of those islands of trees that pop along the emptiness of the snowy plains, protected from the wind so snow does not accumulate much. The mere sight of it made me feel so weak I wanted to just fall, and, as far as I could recall, one or two of the others fell sick once they saw the sight of the carnage. The thing that bothers me about the snow-covered carcass is that it looked so unrecognizable that you would think that it was a long-abandoned deer carcass, with flesh being ripped from the bones and a leg a far distance away. The only way Bob could have known that it was one of his cows was a tag, still attached to the head that is a good distance away from the body. When we found it, it was positioned perfectly on a stump, as if somebody placed it on the stump to relay some strange warning. It also seemingly had its eyes gouged out and tongue ripped out, like the head that was violently torn from the body. We were disturbed by the sight of such ruin. We assumed only a poacher could do this. The sight left us with many questions, and any known evidence we could have found would be buried in snow, and we still have a few missing cattle to find. Bob reported to the police, which they arrived there a while later. Even they were baffled by the sight of it when it led to it, but they chalked it up to some wild animal attack, explaining a bear could do this. Bob wasn't happy with the explanation, pointing to the perfectly placed head on the stump as a counterpoint that a poacher killed the cow rather than some bear. Either way, the police did warn us to look out for any dangerous animals in the area, and Bob cleaned up the remains. Me and my mother returned home only to talk about the sight we saw. I did not sleep well after that. I always felt watched while I slept, as if there was a presence looking at me through the window. Every time I looked, there was nothing there at the window. At the same time, I would also hear sounds coming from the roof of our house, but I chalked it up to be the few feral cats that usually climb the trees and live on the roof. Over the next few days, I noticed a decreasing number of cats. At first, I wouldn't notice since we usually feed the cats outdoors and any cats missing would reappear. It seems those we do not see stay unseen. We worry something might be happening to them, like a pack of coyotes or even someone feeding them windshield fluid, but we do not see the bodies. I counted at least 6 of them gone, likely more. That was until 5 days after the cow killing when something came up. In between our house and the schoolhouse is the villa, or a place where the old go to be taken care of. The reason for the villa to be there is, at least what I thought, simply down to the fact the elders wanted a simpler life, like the rest of us, Mennonite or not, for the rest of their days. Today, however, things are getting more complicated than anyone could handle. As far as I heard, on that morning, one of the people there walked down the driveway at the villa and saw something red around the tree. He went closer and realized that there are objects around the tree within the red-stained snow. The man noticed something terribly wrong with what he is seeing. What he was seeing is 7 poorly severed heads of cats within blood-stained snow, and he looked up to see their torn bodies hanging in the bare tree branches. He turned to call out the others on this grisly spectacle, and more people surrounded the tree. Even the neighboring Mennonites went to see the sight, only to recoil at the mere sight of it. The police eventually arrived, and this time they cleaned up the scene, leaving behind a tree surrounded by blood-stained snow. This was told to me by Barney, one of our neighbors who went to the scene. He stated that he thinks somebody is killing the animals for the fun of it, while also thinking this is somehow connected to the missing cows. I was struggling to comprehend who or what is doing this or the actual reason behind this. I went outside to look at the blood-soaked snow that moats around the tree. As I looked from the entrance to the villa, I started to think the cats weren't killed by the tree, as there was seemingly no sign of a struggle in the snow. It looked like the cats were placed there, as there were no splashes around the pool. I tried to look for tracks, but what would be left of it seems to be trampled by the many footsteps of those who visited. As I was walking back to my house, I heard someone yell out something from a distance away. I turned to see a middle-aged man, dressed in jeans and a plaid-button shirt with a coat, walking sternly towards me in the road. I recognized as one of the neighbors, but he looked like he was mad or something. I was looking on in a confused stance as he walked up to me, grabbed me by my sweater, and angrily told something in his angry twang that the devil has come to town. I was held up for a few seconds until Bob broke it up and argued with the guy. Eventually, he walked away, and Bob assured me everything is going to be okay. That is not where it ends. Strange remains of animals are still being reported, and each more bizarre. In another area nearby, at another of those tree islands, somebody found a site of a pile of dismembered coyote corpses. To the north, there was also a report of 3 dead horses, whose bodies are torn up. The heads were missing until they were found nearby in a triangle configuration, disturbing those who saw the sight. Ever since that, more animals in the area disappeared. It even got so bad people won't let their pets alone in fear they may go missing. Police began to think that a few sick individuals are involved. However, the only proof is the crime done. By this point, no one knew who the suspects are. That was until one night. When I was trying to sleep in my room, I heard a tapping through the window that is facing towards the pasture. I thought it was a branch tapping on the window, so I looked up. At first, I confirmed by belief that it was a branch. That was, until it moved in a way a branch wouldn't, and what seems to be more of those branches appeared. The branches are fingers. Fingers long and emaciated, ending in long claws. The fingers followed up to a hand that looked almost human. Imagine holding out your hand and try to make your index finger do the same function as the thumb. The only way to do that is to put the index finger nearer to the thumb itself. That is the hand I saw. The size of the palm took roughly less than a quarter of the 2-foot by 2-foot window. As the hand reached down, I could see it was connected to an arm that is in similar condition to the fingers. After a few moments, the hand suddenly shot up in a split second and the banging of the roof began, only to last a mere few seconds. After that, my mother rushed down the stairs to shut the door open, asking if I was okay. By this point, I was frozen in place in shock. She asked if I heard the noises from the roof. All I could muster is a nod. The next day, I evaluated my experience and asked my mother what it was she heard, knowing the answer. Instead, she explained to me that, when she was trying to sleep in her room upstairs, when she looked through her window, she swore she saw an eye. It wasn't human, but rather like a goat's, and what was its hairless face taking over half of her similarly sized window. She stayed still for a few moments until it seemed to see light coming from the north and was gone in a split second. During this movement, she thought she caught sight of its bunny-like ears and the noises began, but gone as they began. I then told her about my experience, and we were in agreement that we saw the same creature. We also agreed to not tell anyone about the experience, as telling anyone this seemingly ridiculous story would make us look crazy. The animal disappearances continued, but declined a little, maybe because more people are keeping their pets inside. Eventually, they stopped once spring came along, and we all thought it was the end of it. People are letting their dogs and cats out, not giving a worry about them. The farmers no longer had to monitor the cattle as, not only they had to worry about the events happening, but there were less predators at the time. There was a period of relief until it got worse. It happened sometime in the late part of spring. As far as I heard, one of our farmer friends, Nathan, came over to another of his buddies' place, Howard. Both lived nearby. He knocked on the door of the house, expecting a welcome from him as usual. Instead, there is no answer at the door. He kept knocking, assuming he was asleep or something. He eventually called him and heard his phone from inside. He was hoping for a response. There was none. Nathan became concerned, assumed that he had a heart attack or he was dead, so he tried to find a way in. He looked around the house, crowbar in hand, trying to look for a window low enough to open. He found none, so he got through the door and went in. As he walked up the stairs and into the first floor, he saw there was nothing wrong. Everything seems to be in place until he went to the bedroom where Howard is supposed to be. When he opened the door, the place was a mess. Bed sheets were everywhere. Drawers have fallen down, broken glass, and, oddly enough, the bed that is upside down near a broken window. He could see the phone near the bed, broken but working. He called the police to report this, and they did an investigation once they arrived. That is at least what I was told. Either way, Howard was missing. Howard wasn't the only one missing, however. He was the start of a series of odd disappearances that continued all the way through summer. It ranges from the usual, like a hiker going missing, to the bizarre, an entire family disappearing from a home without any reason. I think I counted at least 15 missing throughout. What makes this more unusual is the supposed perpetrators seem to never leave a trace, other than the damage they leave behind, from broken windows to smashed-in doors. The police were confused, trying to find every suspect possible. To some, it seems like the same people who killed the cats and took their pets are starting to take the people. Others find it really unexplainable and scary, so they took the effort to not go alone outside at night, fearing they may become missing. It went so far as to hunting parties looking for the group responsible, and, still, they happened. Animals began disappearing again, albeit at a lesser rate. People still kept their pets inside, and farmers began to monitor their cattle again. It was a risky time. Nothing is safe once the sun goes down. All that was my summer break was staying inside most of the time, playing games with my mother and drawing fictionalized maps. I then remembered the night that I saw the hand, and I at least thought it was connected to the disappearances. I then looked on the internet for anything that described the creature. The closest thing I found to the description of this thing is the Wendigo, who you all know, with the skinwalker a close second. Wendigo, however, are still somewhat human and don't have bunny ears, nor does a skinwalker turn into a hairless abomination we saw on that night. I looked harder, finding no luck on it, until I found something unexpected. I can't remember the site, but it had to do something with Cree legends in the area, of which included the Wendigo, just under Wetiko. What I read was different from the story of the Wendigo. It had to do with the mythology of the moon rabbit, who wished to ride it one day and asked Crane to take him to the moon. Along the way, his hand is somehow bleeding and marked it on Crane's head, explaining the red mark on every Crane's head today. What it did not tell, at least according to the site, is that the moon rabbit had a brother. As the story goes, they wanted to ride the moon together, and they asked Crane to carry them up there. But Crane could only carry one at the time. The moon rabbit was being carried by Crane when his brother jumped and tried to grab upon his paws, only to scratch them and fall back down. Stuck on the ground, he could only watch as his sibling went up towards the moon. The winter air came, and he went into his burrow to sleep. He woke up early, figuring the snow would be gone. The snow is gone, but the plants haven't turned green, so he tried to start a fire. The fire then spread, forcing him into his burrow and waiting until it died itself off. When he came out, there was no food in sight, and so he starved, thinning each day and losing his hair. One day, a deer arrived and, in sheer desperation, killed the deer to savor his hunger. On and on. Every animal he saw he killed and ate, but he wasn't satisfied. Even when the grass returned, he was still accustomed to eating the flesh of others, only hunting at night to see his brother, riding the moon and hoping to come. Man then arrived and, unlike him, only killed when they needed to. The hungry rabbit contorted himself to be more man-like to be with man, only for them to be revolted by its horrific stature. Angry, he killed the whole tribe and ate them. The other tribes, hearing of this, descended upon the land he resided, burning the land so there was nothing for him. This did not stop it, going as far to kill the tribes who set fire to its land. The tribes who remained were forced to offer their own to satisfy the beast. Wesikchak, trickster hero to the Cree, saw this and thought out a plan to stop it. One night, while the beast was hunting, he turned into the moon rabbit and spoke to him. Surprised, the hungry thing told him how sorry he was for scratching his paw and asked him if he could go to the moon with him. Wesikchak, in the moon rabbit form, told him he couldn't go as he killed others to only satisfy himself. The beast then noticed that he did not have any scratches on his paw, so it called out Wesikchak and chased him, falling into his own burrow in the process. The other tribesmen then put a heavy rock over the burrow, trapping it. It is unknown whether the beast starved to death or was just sleeping, but one thing is certain, the rock should remain sealed. Now, I do not know if this was a real Cree myth, as other websites never mention this mythology, but it shares some similarities with the creature I saw. The contorted human-like rabbit form, the disappearances, matched in my mind. I still have one more question left to answer, as to where the burrow of the creature is. I began to research the reports of missing animals and people. What I have found is a trend. The disappearances themselves tend to increase in frequency once it is at least during the appearance of the half-moon phase, at its greatest frequency during the full moon phase, and goes silent once the other half-moon phase passes. As for the killings, they only seem to occur during a full moon. As for the distribution of these occurrences, the furthest one out is about some 18 miles from here at some park near a lake. From there, they seem to get more frequent the nearer they are to my hamlet. It seems whatever is responsible for the occurrences is somewhere at the hamlet. The question is, where in the hamlet would it be? That is another time. For then on, the occurrences continued, until early fall when things changed. During one night, on a nearly full moon only covered by clouds, a couple were driving down the single-laned highway that provides access to my hamlet. They were talking until they narrowly hit a deer that was running from the hamlet's side. They stopped in shock as a herd of deer ran across the road. As the last deer began to cross the road, something snatched it from view. All they could hear is the screaming agony of the deer until, like a switch, silence took over again. For a few moments, it was simply silence, until they heard some sort of voice coming from where the deer was snatched. The voice sounded as if something was trying to make words, but missing a lot of the stresses that make a proper human speech possible, resulting in a gargling mess of sounds. As they were hearing the voices, they got closer until they spotted what seems to be a tube of some kind hitting the road. Based on their accounts, this tube that had some sort of appendages at the bottom was about 8 feet tall, thick as a tree trunk, was all they could see in their headlights. They said it was possible the tube was connected to something out of view of the light. All of a sudden, they heard a thump on the roof, and the voices turned into a deep, primal crackling of whatever creature had such legs. They then sped around the tube, which they figured by now a leg of the threatening creature that made those sounds. They went a few miles away until they felt safe from the thing. They eventually got out, only to find blood on their roof. They later called the police, of which the police suspected the couple made the story up to cover the fact they hit the deer. When the police went to where they reported the incident, they saw no sign of the dead deer. They charged the couple and went on their way. At least, this is what I heard by word of the others I managed to piece together. The odd thing is the only damage to the vehicle is the roof, where they supposedly heard the thumping sound. This has taken over me, of course, but I had to find a way to stop, to find its lair. I had tried to look for the location of where it could be. I guess I was frantic. It affected my life at school, with grades lowering and not handing in schoolwork on time. I was distracted by this point. As classmates would talk about theories of Wendigos or skinwalkers, I was more interested in the location of the supposed creature. Sometime in the middle of fall, during a clear, cold night, I was in bed, sleeping until I heard something in the distance outside. I sat up in bed and I wasn't sure what it was at first. The longer I listened, the more I am convinced the bells are ringing at the schoolhouse. I found it unusual that someone would ring the bell in the night. Investigating this, I carefully grabbed my shoes and my sweater and came outside, to the middle of the road. Walking towards the schoolhouse, the sound grew louder and louder, constantly ringing until it slowly stopped. I was confused, looking towards the schoolhouse in stark confusion. I had a feeling in my gut that I was being stalked by something, a haunting feeling I still remember to this day. All of a sudden, something hit my head and all went black. I then woke up in a slightly lit area, immediately noticing something wrong with my vision. Touching the area where my right eye should have been, I was instead met with a hollow, and it was becoming apparent as it began to hurt. I reached out to the front of my left eye and noticed blood on my finger. As much as it scares me about a missing eye, that was the least of my concerns as I was looking around to see the area. Where I am at, it is a large cavern, minus the stalactites, basking in a warm light coming from my right and smells of rotting meat. When I looked down, I was shocked in horror as I saw the wretched bodies of many animals. It is hard to remember this. The trauma it had caused me was permanent, but I'll try to describe what I did to get out of there. I was looking around, frozen like a deer in headlights, at the many corpses that lay in this cave. I then shook it out, remembering that I had to escape this hell. I carefully moved over the corpses, trying not to step on them and aware something could still be in the cave. Eventually moving to a clear enough path, I moved to where the light came from. I noticed that the orange light flickers. Getting closer, I realized it was a fire going, a relatively large one. Missing an eye puts me at a disadvantage, as anything to my right would be blocked by my nose. Also, it was bleeding, feeling the streams coming down my face. I needed to get something to cover my wound very quickly. Looking around the fire, I noticed a large pile of clothes at the other side of the fire. Being cautious, I very slowly walked around the fire, still looking around the darkness in an endless, paralyzing fear. Eventually, I got there, but the clothes themselves were mostly dirty and blood-covered. I dug through the clothes, recognizing that they once belonged to somebody. I eventually found a sleeve of a white sweatshirt, so I wrapped it around my head to cover my bleeding socket. I then heard something within the cave in the distance. It prompted me to hide in the clothes, stinking of sweat and mold while seeing through my left eye to an opening. It sounded like scratching and footsteps, getting closer and louder to the fire where I am staring. The scratching then stopped, and the footsteps continued, assuming it was in the cave already. Looking behind the fire, I could see a hairless, pale, small-bodied figure walking around on thin legs and carrying something in its thin arms. As it walked into darkness, I thought I saw its bunny-like ears upon the head of the creature. All of a sudden, it produced a sound that sounded like an angry bull but higher-pitched, almost like a blood-curdling scream of a woman about to die in the horror movies. The thing came out of the darkness. The sight of it will haunt me in my dreams as I saw its face for the first time. It looked like a combination of a rabbit and a human, with a somewhat human-like mouth, a rabbit's nose and eyes that are in proportion when compared to a human, I could tell the eyes are dilated, with large pupils taking up half of its eyes. I could see what seemed to be blood around its mouth as it opened them. The teeth looked like broken glass placed haphazardly all over the inside of its mouth as it gaped unusually wide, nearly reaching to the base of the neck, as it produced that same scream. It seems to be looking all over the place for something, going under the bodies and turning over the bones and screaming. It seems to be angry that I am gone from the body pile it had made. It then went around the fire to crouch down in front of the clothes pile, blocking the light and my view as it reached out with those familiar large hands towards me. The creature then hesitated as there are noises coming from the entrance where it came from. The noises themselves sounded like shouting, but the creature screamed, filtering out the voices. The creature quickly walked towards the same entrance, clawing through the entrance until its sounds were gone. I could hear gunfire coming from the entrance as more footsteps are coming, but more human this time. I then saw Bob and a few other men with flashlights and shotguns running into my view, also searching for me, but for an entirely different reason. As one of the men got close enough to the clothes pile, I reached out my left hand and the man noticed. He then called out the rest of the men to come to me. Bob looked at me shocked, and he picked me up, carrying me while surrounded by the others. As we got to the entrance, the men turned around, shining their flashlights, only for the creature to pop out. The men began shooting it, with some shells hitting the creature and the others at the cave walls. It is affected by them, adding to the collective of bullet holes already in it. This did not slow it down, as it proceeded to grab one of the men and bite off his head, only to toss it aside as it swiped at another of them, throwing him across the cavern. We went between its legs, narrowly escaping the thing as the others are still shooting the thing, with some shells zooming past us. Bob ran and ran through the cave for 10 minutes until we met with the other men. There, a rope ladder is there, going up about 100 feet. A rope then came down as the screams of the creature got closer and closer. Bob proceeded to put me down on a board and wrap the rope around me at the belly, eventually tying me down to the board. I was then pulled up as the others began to shoot down the entrance, towards the hellish thing coming. Some of the men began to climb the ladder and, for a few minutes, I could hear shooting and screaming coming from below. Eventually, I was being dragged out of the entrance by a few others, and that is when I began to be in and out of the blackness. Eventually, the darkness took over and I thought I was dead at the time. I woke up in a hospital bed, within the blue sheets and still missing vision from the right eye, but less blood. I looked around in the white sheet walls when I saw a hand poking out. The curtains opened to reveal my mother. She was crying and came at me for a hug, telling me that she is worried about me. The nurse came in to tell me that, other than the missing eye, I'll recover. They stayed around for a few minutes while we chatted about life at home. Eventually, my mother said her goodbyes and the nurse said she'll return to check on me. After they left, Bob came out, walking towards me to give me a hug. I asked what happened and he was hesitant, telling me if I am sure that I wanted to hear this. I shook my head in agreement. He told me slowly that he heard of my taking by one of the elders at the villa. The person claimed the creature went to the schoolhouse and somehow squeezed through the windows of the schoolhouse. The elder eventually called Bob to tell him about it. Bob did not believe this at first, but the elder is adamant about it, swearing to God even. He drove to the schoolhouse to find it empty at first. He kicked down the doors of the building and gained access. At first, the room seems perfectly normal, only to notice a hole in the wall. He walked down the stairs behind the busted wall to a stone basement. Within the basement, he saw what seemed to be some kind of stone altar. In front of this stone altar is a big hole, roughly about 10 or 20 feet in diameter. The moment he thought something is wrong was when he saw pools of blood near the entrance. He exited the building to call up his buddies, of which he told them to get flashlights and shotguns. He waited a few minutes until, apparently, a whole army of Mennonites showed up before his buddies, also told by the old man about the creature. They also came with guns and flashlights and even told him he will help him find his friend's daughter and kill the hellish beast. His friends eventually arrived, at first arguing with the Mennonites until they heard the creature's hellish scream. Some became reluctant, but eventually willing to do as there is an army of men there to help, no matter what. As the Mennonites prayed to God for help and the rest prepared, Bob and some of his buddies came down to the basement to figure out a plan. One of them luckily came with the ladder and hooked it up to the altar. They were worried that the ladder may never reach whatever floor lays down the entrance. To their luck, the ladder had enough length to reach the floor and fasten the ropes to the altar. They told the rest that they are ready and they all loaded up their guns. Their plan is that some of the men would be at the floor of the drop-off while the rest stay up at the surface. A group, led by Bob, would go through the cave to find me. The police were called in the case things got worse. You get what happened next in the cave, but the surface is different. The police did arrive, but they were telling everyone to leave. They even threatened to arrest anyone who don't do what they said. The group were reluctant, as the plan is already set in motion and did not want the plan to go wrong. A confrontation ensued and they argued, until the screams came again from the schoolhouse, along with gunfire. That was the moment the police figured out the situation and decided to join them. When I blacked out, the creature killed a few more men, with Bob and others escaping luckily. The Mennonites then threw their homemade Molotovs towards the creature, setting it on fire, with it retreating into the cave. The schoolhouse is eventually burned down to block the entrance, trapping the creature down in the cave. I asked him whether he'll tell anyone about it. He explained that everyone knew about it, but that he, along with the people involved, wouldn't tell a soul as it'll get people curious and go to the place, potentially releasing it again. He was also relieved that I somehow survived the whole ordeal, and I have thought about it since. Years later, I am still pondering about that thought. The fire burning in that cavern would have filled it with carbon monoxide, even potentially killing the thing. For some reason, it didn't. Either it was just recently lit, or that the system is much bigger than I could imagine. If it is the latter, who knows how many more of those things are underground, waiting to get out onto the surface. Third story. If you have a reservation at the Lost Creek campgrounds, cancel it. I'm posting this in hopes that someone out there may be able to help me. I've started to write and deleted this so many times over the last 6 months or so that it would make your head spin. At first, I thought that no one would believe me, so why bother? Then it became a matter of not wanting to relive those events again. Now, it's all I can think about and I just wanted to stop. Let me explain. This past June, my wife Michelle and I took our 2 teenage girls camping. I'd made our reservations online at a campsite we'd never stayed at before, a quaint little place called Lost Creek Campgrounds. It was a little farther away than we usually went, but the reviews were amazing and the pictures were absolutely breathtaking. I just couldn't pass it up. We used their online map and found an isolated spot that looked perfect for us. When we got there, we set the canopy up over the included picnic table and were putting up the tent when I heard what I thought was a family out hiking. They seemed to enjoy themselves, so I paid little attention until it seemed like they might be lost, calling out to one another for help. I alerted Michelle and was heading to the nearest trailhead to lend a hand when the voices stopped. I chalked it up to a misunderstanding and helped her finish setting up the tent. I was exhausted from the drive and getting camp set up. The kids were complaining about all the bugs and lack of cell phone service. Michelle's energy kept us all going as she hummed some early 90s tune stuck in her head while getting the campfire going. I started thinking about that family in the woods again, but since I hadn't heard anything in a little while, I could only assume everything turned out okay. It was getting dark, so we roasted some hot dogs, made some s'mores, and took turns trying to tell the scariest story before turning in. The girls regaled us with some things they'd read on the No Sleep subreddit about a search and rescue officer. I went with some classic campfire stories like the babysitter and the clown statue and the man with the hook. Michelle was the clear winner with some story I'd never heard her tell before about the time she and her siblings encountered what they thought was a Wendigo while camping in San Antonio. In the morning, we spent some time relaxing at the beach and just enjoying our surroundings. It was a beautiful day, and I couldn't help but think it odd that we were the only ones in the water. There wasn't even a single boat out past the buoys to disturb the still and tranquil lake. It was nice to have the place to ourselves, though. I went swimming with the girls and teased them about all the things they couldn't see in the murky lake water while Michelle laughed from the shore and worked on her tan. We had a few sandwiches for lunch and didn't head back to camp until the early evening. As night fell, I talked them all into doing some night hiking. It was a family tradition that I insisted we keep up on every trip. We wandered around the circuitous trails near our campsite. The woods were an entirely different place at night. There could be something new and exciting around every twist and turn of the trail. Having only the beam of your flashlight to illuminate things added that little taste of adrenaline that kept us going for a few hours. Heading around the last circuit back to camp, I began hearing familiar voices asking for help. This time, Michelle and the girls heard them as well. We headed toward the voices to offer some assistance, but the closer we got to where we thought they were, the further into the maples, hemlocks, and white ash trees the voices could be heard. After 10 minutes, I led us back to camp. I didn't make a big deal about it, but I sensed something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones somehow. I put on a fake smile and teased the girls about our experience to calm them down. We all decided that it was probably just some bobcats. You couldn't go camping anywhere in Ohio without hearing them at some point or another. Sometimes they could sound like a screaming woman or even a crying child. They went to bed content with that information and fell fast asleep in their sleeping bags. Michelle and I curled up by the campfire to enjoy the rare silence together. The older the girls got, the harder it was to come by. An hour later, we heard our youngest daughter calling for us from the woods. That wasn't possible. She was still curled up asleep in her sleeping bag. We could see her. Before we could react, we heard our other daughter's voice coming from the other side of the woods. She was also fast asleep in the sleeping bag next to her sister. We rushed into the tent and locked it down. It was an all-seasons tent. It was thick and durable with locking zippers. We battened down the hatches and held onto each other while I kept an eye out through the little window. I must have dozed off because the sound of a zipper woke me up. I had locked them from the inside, so I assumed one of the girls had gone to the bathroom. Still, I moved to the entry, fearing the worst. When I saw everyone in their sleeping bags, my blood went cold. The zipper inched upwards. I grabbed and held it tight. I saw an impossibly long finger through the screen. I told who or whatever it was to go the fuck away. I took a deep breath as I heard quiet footsteps moving away from the tent. The lock was broken at my feet. Before I could process anything, I heard movement. This time it came from multiple directions. I considered waking everyone. On one hand, I needed help. On the other, a screaming wife and kids seemed like a bad idea. I let them sleep, for better or worse. I felt surrounded, and I smelled something odd, copper and nag campa. I could make out enormous shapes through the tent fabric. The voices rang out as more of them moved in close enough to brush against the tent. I bit my lip till it bled, closing my eyes to steady my nerves. I heard the voices of the family from the first day, the voices of my still sleeping daughters and wife. I nearly lost my hard-earned composure when I heard my voice whispering near where I crouched. I realized what I had missed in the voices all along. While they sounded like copies of human voices, there was something distinctly off about them. Like mimicking instead of speaking. Piecing words together formed conversations without matching tones or tempos. I focused so much on how they sounded I wasn't listening to what they were saying until it became one cacophonic burst of repetition. Hungry. As the first few jagged claws tore long streaks all around the tent, a bright light filled the camp from an unknown source. Through a rip in the entrance door, I could see one of them. It must have been 7 feet tall and was impossibly thin. Its mottled gray skin stretched so tight over its bones that I could see its organs pulse beneath. It glared at me with empty eye sockets so deep that no light could escape them. It lunged at me, ripping the rest of the fabric to shreds as I finally screamed to wake up Michelle and the girls. I knew at that moment I was dead. There was nowhere to run, and soon we would all be devoured. I shut my eyes as it tore into my chest. An explosion of sound followed by warm liquid raining down on me assaulted my senses, but somehow I was alive. By the time I opened my eyes, I'd heard a dozen more small explosions in quick succession, mixed with the confused screams of my family as they were harshly awakened. Men approached the wreckage of our tent, shotguns in hand. They ushered us to their trucks and drove us into the nearby town. I had so many questions, but the men stayed quiet till they got us to safety. They called them forest mimics. Something had been stirring them up over the last few weeks, and more people had gone missing than usual. They'd shut down the campgrounds until they could sort it out. Our online reservation had somehow gone unnoticed, and by the time they stumbled upon our camp, it had nearly been too late. We never went back for our gear. As a family, we stick to resorts and indoor lodgings these days. Michelle and the girls were lucky. They didn't see what I saw. To them, the story has become that time a pack of wild animals attacked our tent. For me, it's something different entirely. I've developed PTSD and severe insomnia since it all happened. Not even the medication I've been prescribed is helping. Some nights I swear I can still hear those voices chanting that word, hungry, in the dark recesses of our home. A month ago the dreams began, and that's why I'm finally posting this now. In those dreams I can hear more than just that single word. They call out to me in their staggered amalgam of voices, their legion-like staccato, shrieking and begging me to come home. On those nights, I wake up crying. I don't cry out of fear or some sense of personal preservation. No. I cry because the longing in their voices is palpable. I cry because of the pain that flares up in the scar that they left on my chest. I cry because I'm hungry. Fourth story. The shed in the woods. Back when I was a stupid teenager, my friends and I would go into the woods behind this old guy's house and do some stupid shit. Sometimes we would play games or tell scary stories until we got too tired or until the old guy chased us off with his shotgun. One night, me and my friends Nate, James, Henry, and Steve were out in the woods behind the old guy's house again and decided we would play hide and seek, so James counted and Nate and I decided to stick together, and we went a little further into the woods this time. The old guy was rich for making some sort of big company. When we came across this old shed that was still in pretty good condition, you could tell because of the condition the outside of it was in. Naturally, Nate and I thought that we could hide in there, so we opened the door only to see a man, not the old man, and you can't even really call it a man. I mean, yeah, it stood on 2 legs and had 2 arms, but its legs were absurdly long and the arms were so long they almost dragged as it walked toward us. Nate and I took a step back when we saw this thing's face. It had at least a dozen eyes and razor-sharp teeth stained with blood. The thing looked at us and let out an ear-piercing roar. That's when we ran. We didn't run anywhere in particular, just somewhere that the creature wasn't. Eventually, we saw the old man's house, and we turned around to see if we could avoid it, only to see nothing until we looked up and saw the creature up in the trees staring at us. Then it jumped down and began to run toward us faster than any human could ever be. That's when we heard a loud noise behind us, and a lot of something hit the creature. The old man had come out and started shooting the creature. But the creature didn't seem to be in pain, as it seemed more annoyed than anything. The old man shouted at us to run, so we did, and as we were running toward our friends, we heard another shot get fired, and then the old man scream. When we got to our friends, they asked where we were because they were looking for us and found nothing. So Nate and I had said we would explain later and that we needed to get out. As we were running, James tripped and started screaming Nate, and I already knew what happened, but Henry and Steve turned around and stopped. A few seconds later, I heard Steve scream and Henry start shouting. When Nate and I arrived to the car, we instantly got in and waited to see if anyone else made it back, and when we see Henry, we were extremely excited, so I opened the door and Nate got the car started, but then I heard something behind Henry and saw the creature jump and grab him, sinking its teeth into his stomach and biting a chunk of his torso off. Seeing his intestines spill everywhere creeped the hell out of me. I quickly closed the car door and told Nate to drive as fast as he could. A few days passed, and my friend's parents kept coming by to see if I saw them or knew where they were. More people eventually went missing, and they were all last seen either in the woods or near them. The rest of the town believes that bears are getting more aggressive, or that there is some kind of serial killer on the loose, but I know the truth. Anyway, a few years later, the police finally decided to check the woods a little more than they did the first time. They got a warrant to search all of the old man's property, and when they went deep into the middle of the woods, they found almost all of the victims. Apparently, they had all been strung up in the trees, with their intestines being used to hang them. This finally convinced people that didn't already believe it that there was a serial killer, with the occasional person saying that it was Bigfoot or a Wendigo, etc. Now at least my friends' parents know where their kids are, but it brings them more questions than it did answers. I feel like this was all somehow caused because Nate and I decided to open the shed because there hadn't been any murders before this. I mean, we had the occasional missing person, but they all got solved within a week or two. Now the police are trying to figure out who did it, and now I'm in and out of the police station because they somehow think Nate and I killed our friends and are now killing other people. All that Nate and I say is that one moment our friends were there, and the next they were gone. But the police know we aren't telling the truth. Every day I consider going there and telling them, but when Nate did that, he ended up in the local psychiatric facility. Someone was killed inside of their own home. Some people believe that the serial killer realized that no one was going to the woods anymore, so now they are breaking into people's houses. But it's so obvious, I have no idea how nobody is caught on at this point. There was a huge hole in the wall that no man could make, and it wasn't an explosive because nobody heard it, and there wasn't any black char around the hole. The police found the man dangling from the opening in the attic, hung up by, you guessed it, his intestines. Missing persons numbers are skyrocketing, and our town has now been deemed the most dangerous in the state. James' parents have hired a private investigator to try to finally catch whoever killed their son. I was interviewed by the private investigator, and he said that he knows I didn't do it. I wonder if he really thinks that, or if he just wants me to give some information up. The private investigator stopped by and told me that he has evidence that I committed the murders, and when I asked him to show me, he showed a clearly faked video of me killing the victims. He said that in a couple days he would have it perfected and he would get credit for solving the case. I did the only thing I could think of, which was grab the gun I purchased, and then I heard a gunshot and saw him on the ground. I used the very little chemistry I knew from school to destroy his body. I don't know why he would fake that footage, maybe for publicity? I guess. But now I am the very thing he accused me of being, a murderer. Apparently no one knew where he was and just assumed that the killer was silencing those looking into the case, which has now scared the police working on the case into working sloppily. They are afraid that the so-called killer is going to go after them. I never realized that the police in this town were such cowards. As I'm typing this, the creature is creeping around my house. It has somehow learned how to open doors and fit through them. I'm currently hiding in my attic, and I have called the police telling them that the killer is in my home, but knowing them it could take a half hour to show up. I can hear it moving right below me, and I know that it will find me because my attic doesn't have a door in the floor, just a ladder, and even though it is pulled up, I know that it can crawl through. I have my pistol on my desk and a rifle next to me. The only thing illuminating the room is a lamp. The orange glow of the candle inside is making me feel even more alone than I am. I am grabbing the rifle and aiming it at the hole. This is most likely a goodbye, as I don't think I can kill it. I did it. The creature is dead. I shot it straight in the head with my rifle and it fell. It's bleeding on the ground right now. In trees. Crunch, 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 crunch. It steadily grew nearer, and I noticed it wasn't the regular four-legged fawns that took their leisurely strolls in the moonlight. No. This was a two-legged anomaly. I must note that I had spent a great deal of time in this van, alone, longer than I'd care to admit. But in this time, I developed a conditioned stimuli to when my better half returned home, like a dog eagerly crouched by the door of its master's domain, wagging its tail at the familiar sound of car keys coming up the steps to greet him after a long day of limbo solitude. Now, I mentioned there was a road nearby. I could always tell when she was returning, first by the sound of music intertwined with the grumbling engine of her friend and his big truck coming up the road. I could hear the car door slam, and out she'd hop into the night, wobbling through the clearing up to the driver's side of the van, and around to finally show her devilish grin in the entrance to our said humble abode. But this unmistakable 1-2 step was coming from deep within the woods, from beyond the drop-off in the thick bushes and trees, a demon coming straight out of no man's land, impossibly steady, like a metronome. It drew nearer and nearer. Crunch, 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 crunch. I cautiously drew the curtains aside and saw quite possibly the most disturbing thing that could have been there. Nothing. Absolutely nothing but trees dimly illuminated by my flashlight of hope. Crunch, 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 crunch. I rubbed my eyes and stared into the abyss, with no avail. Crunch, 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 crunch. I desperately flicked my eyes around, failing to comprehend what was coming my way. The thing had to be right in front of my face by now, but I saw nothing, absolutely nothing but the trees and the darkness. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Time froze. It stopped at my door. If I opened the door from where I was sitting and reached my hand out, I could surely touch it. In every horror movie you've ever seen, this is the moment where something pops out, or at the very least there is a large bang. I did not blink. The only sound that broke the roar of silence was a lone acorn dropping off in the distance. I waited for anything to happen, for this fellow fiend or foe to reveal itself. My mind scrambled to explain this intrusion, with no avail. In one swift movement, I did quite possibly the largest act of bravery I have ever committed and flung the door wide open, flashlight flooding hopeful rays into the jungle of night. Much to my dismay, there was nothing there. Finally, I blinked, utterly terrified, alone, silence. I laid there for an undeterminable amount of time, waiting, listening. I called out for my friend. Surely this was another cruel trick played on me by the mischievous whore. Silence. 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 I longed for an acorn to fall. I was shook. I peered out of the door, to the left, to the right. I needed to sleep. I was hearing things. It's the drugs making you paranoid. Anything to keep the unbearable thought of holy fucking shit, whatever that was, is still outside. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I am crazy. I am hearing things. This is not real. I retreated to the back of the van, clutching my book, my flashlight, and a golf club for protection. Ignore this terrible dream, I said. I read the same sentence over and over for as long as I could bear. 5 minutes passed. I began to relax. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I'm not quite sure. Someone giggled directly outside my door. Whatever was out there sat for a solid 20 minutes in complete silence, just watching me. I died. The startling nearness of the shrill but brief laughter undid the previous half hour of reassurance, and I felt the pure terror of dreams where you try to run or scream, but you can't. All I could do was stare and wait. Just then I heard music and the familiar low grumble of my fateful friend returning from her night of dishonest work. I heard the big truck approach, its car door slam, the familiar wobble up to the van on the proper side. The van door slid open, and there she stood in all her glory, horrifyingly unaware of the evil entity that she was basking in. "What the fuck's your deal?" She laughed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." When I think back to that night, I kinda wish I had. She hopped in the van, slammed the door behind her, and with a grin revealed a bag containing the only substance blacker than night. "Here you go, baby. You must be starving." Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.